All right, so let's talk about some classifications of type. Um, we have some common characteristics. Some of the black letter variations are sometimes called Gothic or Old English. And these different letter forms will help you recognize when you're searching for type for projects and such. Um, but some of the common characteristics that you'll see in these black letter variations is you're going to see, a contrast between stroke weights. So you'll see it thin in some areas and thin and thick in others. There's going to be angled connecting strokes and split ascenders where you see the split. Very calligraphy-like in some of these examples. Oops. And the cloister, which is modeled after Gutenberg's black letter, which is similar to that Gothic manuscript style, it usually has a strong vertical but narrow angled stroke between the verticals. And then the wedding will be less contract in stroke thickness, but very calligraphy influenced swash strokes, these little curvy little accents on the serif of the letter. And then the fracture, which is a different style of a black letter type. It has more curved strokes and less rigid geometry. It abruptly ends, very serif-like transition between the curves and the angled thin strokes. Old style common characteristics are going to have low contrast in stroke widths, and then they're going to have bracketed serifs. So you'll see a slight curve from the stem of the letter into the serif. Just very similar to a bracket that you would use on a bookshelf or something. And so typical typefaces that fit this style are Garamond, for instance, or RT Wague. So a later design with more stroke contrast and still lower than later styles is Caslon. And you still have the bracketed serifs here. They're just a little bit less curvy or more acute of a curve. The transitional reflected improvements in printing and engraving technology. So some of those characteristics, you had greater stroke contrast, you had the serif lengths were more exaggerated than the old style. So the serifs were a little longer, they stuck out more from the stem of the letter. The bracketed serifs were a lot smoother. The transition between the serif and the stroke is sharper. And it had a little bit more ornamental details, like the little curved ear here on the G. So stone serif, still had that bracketed style, but it's less. It had a little bit a softer angle to the bracket of the serif. Now with modern letter forms, these were created from continual refinement of traditional forms in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But they had also a strong contrast in stroke weights. They created vertical emphasis here. The cross strokes near hairlines in some fonts, they became very, very, very thin. The serifs bracketed slightly, if at all, and they had more curved, they had a more common use of curved legs. So with the G down here that you see in the leg of the G. But the serifs were a little bit more squared off and more geometric. So you can see the difference in some of these serif formations here between the old style in Garamond, for instance, to the traditional Baskerville, and then the modern and the Bodoni. Now slab serifs were sometimes called Egyptian. The common characteristics of a slab serif are relatively thick compared with strokes when you're talking about the serifs. They had less, if any, contract in stroke weight. So most of the letters were the same width all the way around. So you see a little bit thicker serifs here. Clarendon is one of a slab serif as well, and you can see those characteristics there. And the Franklin Gothic, the first serifs were invented in the 1800s, which were considered grotesque or ugly. But in later designs, they kept a constant stroke width, but the geometry was less regular. So, for instance, the curved leg on the R and the curved bowl on the A with the Helvetica, compared to the Franklin Gothic. You can tell a difference there. And as we look at more geometric sans serifs, pure geometry was, a lot of this was influenced by the Bauhaus designs and aesthetic. So you had more circular moves or curves that transition directly into straight strokes. There's barely any ornamentation, if there was any. You had round O's and circular shapes. Notice how large the counters are compared to the previous fonts that we looked at in the lecture. This font has a nice example of a one-story A compared to the two-story A here. And there was examples of large open counters. If we look at the G and the A here, we had really big open, large counters inside the letters. And we also had sans serifs designs that were influenced by handwriting. We called this the humanist sans serifs. We had oval shapes. We had the reintroduction of variability in the stroke weights. The curves were softened the harsh geometry, like the leg of the R. Here it was just had a slight curve to it. And another example is the blunt and flat ear of the G. So it's a little bit flatter here. And then we also had script or cursive type. So these script typefaces, were based upon a varied and often fluid stroke created by handwriting. And then we also have novelty type. So everything that doesn't fall easily into one of the previous categories is usually considered a novelty typeface. In the 20th century, especially with the advent of computers, the use and the number of novelty typefaces have grown tremendously. But unfortunately, novelty type is generally overused and frequently misused. So really, novelty typefaces are used for more casual things like a birthday party invitation or something like that, but you would never use a novelty typeface for anything that would be a serious, like, branded typeface that would need to be timeless and sophisticated. You would never use a novelty type on your resume or, in a branded, like, magazine layout or anything like that where readability was important or even more important.